Right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Today, we're going to start a set of talks in which we're going to have on science, technology, innovation, and racial justice that's connected to a senior faculty job search that we're running this spring in the School for the Future of Innovation Society. My name is Kathleen Vogel, and I'm professor and deputy director for SFIS, and I'm also chair of this job search. And I'm so delighted to welcome you all here today. We are so pleased to have Professor Itty Abraham here this afternoon, or in his time, it's very early morning Singapore time. So definitely welcome him bright and early this morning. Professor Abraham is head of the Department of Southeast Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. A political scientist, he's previously served as director of the Global Security and Cooperation, South Asia and Southeast Asia programs at the Social Science Research Council. He has also taught at the University of Texas at Austin, where he directed the South Asia Institute. His scholarly writings have addressed nuclear power and its discontents, interfaces of online and offline worlds, technological citizenship, refugees and host communities, foreign policy, and post-colonial studies. And interestingly, more recently, he's currently immersed in Chinese science fiction. His talk today is entitled Technology and the Political, Confrontation, Recognition, and the Possibilities of a Global STS. Welcome, Itty, and I turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathleen. And thank you to the search committee and everybody else for attending this presentation. It's a little early in the morning here, so if I go a little too fast, it's probably because all the tea I've been drinking is catching up with me. But I'm also trying to get through a lot today, so I hope you'll bear with me. I'm going to do two things in today's presentation, if my PowerPoint will allow me. Yeah. Which is one, to do a presentation about some research that I've just completed and which is in a sense ongoing about a diasporic community of Rohingya activists who are contesting state policies. And I believe it offers us a picture into different modes or different paths by which we can understand the relationship of technology and politics, which is the overall theme for my talk today. And I want to point to some of the contradictions that emerge from that encounter, and then use that as a stepping stone to talk about what is more speculative, what I'm calling a thought experiment, you might say, towards what a global STS might look like. So I want to stress that that last section is definitely preliminary, and it's something that I want, as much engagement with as possible. So see it as both a provocation as well as a set of ideas that I hope will resonate with those of us who are listening today. So this is the outline of the talk. I'm going to first talk about the use of different technologies by the Rohingya activists to contest state policies. I'm arguing that they follow two paths. One is confrontation, the other recognition. Recognition being the one I'm a little more interested in. Then I'll talk about some of the conclusions and contradictions, and then the global STS. So I'm going to jump right in. For some of you who may not be sure exactly where this is, I've got a couple of maps on screen. Myanmar is, of course, very much in the news right now because of the crackdown by the military. It lies between India and China. Thailand, of course, is the recipient of most of the refugee flows that come out of Myanmar. But the area that I'm particularly interested in today lies on the western coast, very close to Bangladesh, just south of Bangladesh. And is composed of a state called the Rakhine state, composed of which there are two kinds of people living there, the Rohingyas and the Rakhine people themselves. Rakhine is also called Arakan. So this gives you a slightly better sense of the huge sort of mosaic of ethnic communities in Myanmar. If there's one thing that's been consistent about Myanmar's history in its post-colonial era since independence from Britain, it's that the majority Bamar population have tried to impose their political and military will on the various minorities of the country. So you could argue that there's been an ongoing ethnic conflict or series of ethnic conflicts in that country ever since 1948. Even within that context, however, the Rohingya have a special place. They are a borderline community, which became one after colonial borders were drawn between what was then Bengal, an Indian province, and Burma. They also, as I said, share this space with the Rakhine community. In the early years of independence, the Rohingya were very much part of the Burmese state, joining parliament, being part of the Constituent Assembly. But once the military took over in 1962, their position changed dramatically. They became racialized as Bengalis and no longer part of, no longer Rohingya and no longer part of the mainstream, if you will, national body of the Burmese people. The first outflow of Rohingya began in 1978 after attacks on them. In 1982, their citizenship was denied. They became officially stateless. In the early 1990s, then again, after 2012, another round of expulsions, another round of ejections. And the stories that I'm sure some of you still remember about ships or boats of Rohingya being found in the middle of the Bay of Bengal or close to Indonesia, where they were rescued by fishermen, have become part of the narrative of the outflow of Burmese, of Rohingya. I'm not going to spend, this is really by just way of giving you some background in terms of who they are and what's happened to them. What I also want you to take away from this little table is the fact that there are 3 generations of Rohingya living overseas now in the exile diaspora or in refugee camps with under different conditions and under different legal statuses. They tend to flee both by land and by sea. The sea journeys, of course, being the slightly more visible and well-known ones. And they are now scattered in a refugee diaspora across all these different countries. I wouldn't trust the numbers hugely, just see them as indicative of the relative numbers of Rohingya in each of these different countries. It's worth noting, of course, that the number in Myanmar is still quite large, probably less than 1 million, probably close to 750,000 now. But as many as 200,000 live in Saudi Arabia and 150,000 in Malaysia. Those are more or less correct numbers. So the point being that there's a diaspora of Rohingya refugees, and it's that community that I want to talk about today. I want to begin by talking about a group of activists that I got to meet first about 4 years ago, living in Kuala Lumpur with some degree of legal status. So they're not completely underground. Most have been educated. They have technical training for the most part. And they've turned their technical training to try and contest the policies of the Rohingya, of the Burmese government, by creating what is effectively a national television channel using YouTube. Now, in this particular image, which is a screen grab from a couple of years ago, sorry, a little earlier this year, I want you to notice the text that lies below this, the picture of Aung San Suu Kyi. It's a little bit small, but if you take a look at it, you'll see that it's a script that may be a little bit unfamiliar with you. It's the Rohingya script, and it's something that I want to come back to in a little while. Now, one reason why Rohingya TV is quite successful today, is quite a lot of credibility, is because it uses reporters actually reporting from the field. As you can imagine, that's a rather dangerous thing to do in the context that they're living in. And so the reporters, in a sense, are hiding in plain sight, you might say, pretending to be local fishermen or just local villagers. They work with cell phones. They power them through solar solar cells. And report directly from the field, often not knowing whether other people are doing the same thing in order to make sure that there's journalistic credibility here. They report on this news from the Rakhine state, the conditions of the community, what the actions of the Myanmar government are. But they also go on to talk about other forms of activism vis-a-vis the Rohingya, including what's happening in the European Union or in other multilateral bodies. So they try and give as complete a picture of the Rohingya community and its scattered diasporas as much as possible. Now here, take a look at this picture, which would be a typical image of a news broadcast in the evenings. And here you see the script is the Burmese script underneath the image of the people getting off the ship and walking towards the land. And again, I'll come back to this question of script in a second. So what I want to suggest is that the channel operates essentially as a national television channel, representing the Rohingya to the world, making sure that people don't forget what the conditions that they're in. It's up to date. It's kept up to date with these reporters acting all the time. It also documents as much as possible in the hope that somewhere down the line, there might be some legal response to this particular situation, whether it's in the International Criminal Court or some other setting. So this is both in one sense of reporting on the state of the affairs, as well as a documentation center for the possibility that the war crimes and the crimes against humanity that have been applied to the Rohingya will get an accounting at some future date. As you can see, their YouTube channel has about 257,000 subscribers, but that probably is an underestimate in terms of the number of people who actually watch this, because often these are watched, as I saw in the diaspora in Malaysia, these are often watched by 2 or 3 people at the same time, or we might have a computer on in the background and people are going about their business, sort of taking a quick look at the screen to see if when something comes up. That particular kind of engagement, I want to call a politics of confrontation. It's a familiar kind of politics, which I think is familiar to anybody who thinks about the way in which oppressive governments and social movements, or particular individuals or communities respond. It's a direct confrontation which looks to redress, which looks to correct, which looks to say, this is what the government is doing to us. Here's what we have to say in response. And so in a sense, the field of politics, you might say, is a relatively simple one. It's very much couched around the idea of an oppressive government and a community which is trying to respond in some way, and in offering, in a sense, a counter narrative which contests and disagrees and argues for a different way of seeing the information that's being put out by the state. There is, however, another set of activities that these activists are doing, which I'm going to call the politics of recognition. Here, I identified 3 particular moments that I think are really worth mentioning. One is not exactly a technology. It's the CONIFA World Cup, which I'll say about something in a second. But the second 2, the Unicode Consortium and the blockchain database, I think are really quite interesting and something that we should pay a little more attention to. So for those of you who don't know, there is a Confederation of Independent Football Associations, which runs a biennial football competition for non-sovereign places and people that are not eligible to take part in the FIFA World Cup. Now, for the organizers, their claim is that, of course, this is not a political statement at all, rather that this is simply a chance for those people for those communities and those bodies that are not considered national bodies to be represented on an international stage and play the world's most popular sport for the pleasure of those who are watching. The last World Cup was meant to be held in 2020, but it was cancelled as a result of the COVID pandemic. So the last one that was actually held was in London in 2018 and hosted by the Somali diaspora in London, in England, called the Barawers. Now, other teams that have taken part in this competition include Northern Cyprus, Padania, a region of northern Italy dominated by the Northern League, Sakaliland, a Hungarian linguistic minority in Romania, the Punjab, which is divided between India and Pakistan, but the players are mostly from the Punjabi diaspora, Western Armenia, Abkhazia, and Tibet, the United Koreans, Tamil Elam, and many, many others. Now, now we have the Rohingya Football Club, which is hoping to join this particular organization and take part in the next World Cup, whenever that might be held. Now, why do you think they might want to be a part of something like this? Well, this is actually, even though it doesn't get the kind of attention that the World Cup does, it does offer a platform to promote and normalize a Rohingya identity as a legitimate national presence, while reinforcing public awareness of their marginalization and oppression within Myanmar. States, of course, respond rather negatively to this particular competition. China, in particular, has threatened corporate sponsors and others every time this is held, because Tibet takes part as an independent entity, and they claim that Tibet has no standing to do that. But states run a real political risk by protesting too much at these sorts of events. The extent of opposition towards these sorts of groupings can be read, I believe, in direct relation to the strength of competing claims to territories under their jurisdiction, bringing into question the legitimacy of legally authorized states. Conflict that states want forgotten, such as this dispute between Abkhazia and Georgia, are kept alive. It reminds international and domestic audiences of the array of political forces that suppress regions, languages, nationalities, and cultures, and that seek to erase alternative identities with the myth of the homogeneous nation state. Item 2. I'm going rather fast, I know, but I'm just, again, trying to get through quite a lot, so bear with me. And I'm happy to come back to any of this later in the Q&A. The second example that I want to point to is the digitizing of the Rohingya script, which we saw earlier on screen through Unicode. As I'm sure most of you know, individuals and groups cannot make unilateral decisions to represent a linguistic script digitally, whether on screen or online. But in order to make a script visible in any digital medium, this could be the Roman script in which English is written, or the Devanagari script in which Tamil, Hindi and Nepali are written, permission must be granted by the Unicode Consortium, a US-based and registered nonprofit corporation that regulates the representation of text in all modern software products and standards. Decisions on digitizing a script or specific characters are taken by two committees of the consortium, the Unicode Technical Committee and the International Organization for Standardization Subcommittee and its working group. The iOS committee is the one that makes the final decision on the name and the standardization of scripts. So a new script application is usually approved only after numerous rounds of review and revision, taking several years. The application has to meet a number of standards, the most important of which is that the language is still very much in use and that the number of users is adequate to justify the material and technical investments needed to generate a new script online. The requirements for the approval of a script include the origins and social history of the language, a list and properties of individual characters, a comprehensive bibliography of recent works in the script, and examples of fonts. More than this, Unicode is actually very interested in the users of this particular script, and in particular, if there are children who will be using the script. So one of the things they look for example, are textbooks, school textbooks that might be useful, that are being used in the script, and that gives justification for them to spend the money and the investment in order to make this visible. Now, originally, the Rohingya language did not have a script. People used either Burmese or Bengali in order to write things down. But soon it became clear as the crackdown on the Rohingya continued that using either of those two scripts was unacceptable. Using Bengali was unacceptable because that's exactly what the Burmese government had been saying, namely, you're all Bengalis, you should go back there. And using the Burmese script was unacceptable because that represented the script of the oppressive force that was trying to push them down. So as a result, in the 1980s, a well-known preacher, a Maulvi by the name of Muhammad Noor, developed a script which is now called Hanifi, the Hanifi script after his name Hanif, and started developing the script which started getting used in Burma. It was immediately banned as soon as it was realized that there was a new script emerging, but it was used in newspapers and has actually become quite prominent across the diaspora rather than within the country itself because of this legal provision. These activists started working with a language lab at the University of California and got the help of people there to put all the pieces of it together, especially the technical parts of it. But what they had to do was collect all the different examples of the script that they could find across the world. This is an example of the kind of school textbook that they used. It took a long time, as you can imagine, because once they started doing this, they realized in a sense how difficult it was to do this. There was no dictionary, for example, for the language. So they had to develop their own dictionary and on and on. I mean, think again of the example of another new language that was created in terms of how important it is for creating national identity. And I'm thinking, of course, of the way that Hebrew became a language for the Israeli community, a language that had not been used in everyday form, and then became the national language of a new country. So the idea behind this is very, very sensible from a political standpoint, which is to say that once we have a standard language, which unifies these different pieces of the diaspora, it makes much more difficult for the Burmese government to argue that we are not a nation, that we are not a people, that we're not distinct. And that's very much why the Rohingya have spent so much time and trouble in order to get this script approved by Unicode. Approximately 300,000 students were using this in different ways, but the more important part is how digitization of the script gives this dispersed Rohingya community a new medium to express themselves, which will promote uniformity in text and strengthen community identity. Particularly for a diaspora used to negotiating multiple national contexts with different rules, grammars, and languages, having a standardized means of communication is no small matter. Additionally, with the decline of traditionally printed materials such as books and newspapers, the importance of having an online presence simply cannot be underestimated. Or let's put it this way, the cost of not being online in today's world is extremely high. Having the Rohingya script available is a major advance in the claim that there is a distinct Rohingya identity that cannot be reduced either to Burman or to Bangladeshi. Receiving Unicode acceptance, which is comprised of, as I showed you in this image here, major international corporations as well as governments, goes beyond then just a simple technical claim or a technical consideration to becoming international recognition by sleight of hand, enabling the claim that Unicode's consulting bodies, including private corporations and sovereign governments, have endorsed the national claims of the Rohingya people. They haven't, of course, but it can be used in that way to, in effect, claim that they have. And to be honest, it's not going too far to suggest that in a digitally drenched world, the implicit support of Facebook may matter more than the active support of some of the smaller members of the United Nations. This is what the alphabet looks like. And as you can see, the choice was ultimately made not to look for a script that looked either like Bengali or Burman, but rather the one that looked like Arabic. Now, this was, of course, a strategic choice because if you think back to the map I showed you a little earlier of where the diaspora is located, there's a large community based in Saudi Arabia, which uses Arabic as their second language. And of course, allows identification with the Muslim community worldwide far more easily. And also gets a lot of funding from the people in Saudi Arabia who tend to be the most financially stable of the diaspora. Okay, third example of a different kind of claim of politics of recognition is creating a digital nation through through blockchain. So among the most now most of the diaspora is based in Asia, and as I'm sure some of you know, most of Asian countries have not signed the Refugee Convention. In other words, even though UNHCR operates in most Asian countries, the status of people who are seeking asylum is not a legal one. They're considered irregular migrants, and even though they might be registered with the UNHCR, their standing in a legal standpoint is somewhat murky. It's not quite, depending on the country we're talking about, Indonesia and Malaysia, for example, they fall between the cracks in terms of being legitimately there or acknowledged as asylum seekers waiting for resettlement or some other condition, depending on where they are in the process. As a result, what happens when irregular migrants seek basic health care or the education of children or the search for sustainable livelihoods, they're not able to do so in a way that would be normal. A typical example, and not one that I'm making up, but one that we actually encountered, was of a pregnant lady who needed to go to hospital in order to have her baby. Well, in Malaysia, you're allowed to do that. The baby was delivered in the hospital free of charge, but the doctors refused to record the birth as having taken place. And the reason was, they said that because then later on she could use this claim in order to ask for Malaysian citizenship, even though she had no status as a Rohingya refugee. So literally the moment she walked out that door with the baby in her hand, someone could have argued that it wasn't her baby and taken it away from her. I know that's an extreme way of saying this, but this is the kind of condition that people without official status may face when there's an absence of legal and official registration of who they are. Documentation, in other words, for their families, for their well-being, for their livelihood, is completely absent. And it's in order to fill this gap that the Rohingya Project began a process of creating a database in order to give undocumented Rohingya, and eventually others as well, a digital identity through the creation of a virtual database. The purpose of the database is to enable each registered person to be identified uniquely, giving them a digital identity that is secure and independent of state controls. Of course, what this means also is once the database is complete, it'll effectively become a census of undocumented Rohingya around the world. Now, this is not official, but it is an alternative locus of information for undocumented Rohingya to register their presence and document their life transitions, albeit in an informal setting. The virtual database, I would argue, mimics the state institution of the official census, creating another foundation for the articulation of a distinct Rohingya national identity. Now, the process by which people are included in the database is quite elaborate and quite comprehensive. There's process of identification, authentication, and authorization. And during the initial process, identification process, the existence of the person is verified. And following the final authentication process, the identified person receives a private key and becomes authorized for access to eventually, it's not yet ready yet, financial transactions, documentation, and other services that this database hopes to provide. Now, the identification process is one thing that we have to spend, I think, a moment on just to see what they're doing. They begin with an investigation of their familial and social relations of anyone who wants to be in this database, as well as geographical, social, linguistic, cultural, and occupational knowledge. The assessment exercise begins by verifying that an applicant is Rohingya and is stateless. Questions then seek to uncover knowledge that is assumed to be uniquely accessible to the Rohingya people, including the language and particularities of the Arakan landscape. In cases where an applicant has not been born and raised in Rakhine State and has parents that are not registered with the project, questions about the homeland are dispensed with, but questions on other categories, including language and culture, must be answered correctly. Now, this becomes, as I will argue in a second, this process of seeking to identify false positives, namely people who may seek to enter this database to take advantage of what it means to be Rohingya, is something that is taken extremely seriously. There's a very skeptical approach built into this database project. And the people who are putting it together argued that migrant workers from Nepal and Bangladesh living in Malaysia sometimes seek to pass as Rohingya in order to benefit from the local sympathies of fellow Muslim people living in Malaysia. Okay. So I'm coming to my first set of conclusions before I move to the second part of my talk. And just to summarize what I've said so far. The Rohingya TV, I'm arguing, is a form of confrontational politics, directly contesting state power, messages, and meanings. It shapes a counter-narrative and offers a high reputational cost for Myanmar, including, of course, the legal implications of the kinds of political actions that have been taking place for the last many years. Now, this is valuable, this is important, but I would also argue it does not change the status quo appreciably. Seeking international recognition through CONIFA, Unicode, and blockchain, on the other hand, offer a very different kind of politics altogether because they undermine state legitimacy by displacing it altogether. They're not looking to the state at all in order to provide an access or a point of entry into a political claim. They're essentially saying we are a people and here are the different ways in which we are a people, and our claim to Arakan and our claim to being a nation cannot be contested because being endorsed in all these different ways. It does so by setting up an alternative parallel authority structure that has taken on state functions, in a sense, providing a parallel system using the endorsement of international agencies, of international corporations, and tacitly some other governments, offering, I would argue, a far greater threat to the state by claiming the ability to do things that only the state is supposed to be able to do. So the idea here very much is recognition from alternative bodies, alternative authorities, bypassing the state altogether, denying the legitimacy of the state as being able to make claims of this kind, in a sense, producing a kind of new form of citizenship, deterritorialized, which is crucial for them to claim that they are, in fact, a people who need recognition and have a place in the international system. The contradictions built into this system, however, have to be taken extremely seriously as well. In particular, I want to reinforce the idea that the database project is built into it skepticism of the state in terms of deciding who can and who cannot be a Rohingya person, a genuine Rohingya person. By using the measurements of memory of place, of customs, of language as the primary means of establishing authenticity, is increasingly anachronistic for a community who are living more and more in the diaspora than in the homeland itself, and now who have as many as 3 generations of people who have lived outside. The kinds of hybridities that you can imagine coming out of people who have been separated from their homeland for now almost 40, 45 years has to be imagined. And yet the demands of this particular database, in a sense, are really geared towards those people who have lived and grown up in Arakan and who have left only recently. this is an almost increasingly a more and more difficult task. And the organizers of the database are increasingly recognizing this, but not sure what to do about it, because for them, this is the way that, the only way that they're going to be able to restore and return to their territorial homeland at some unspoken date. This is one of the means by which this is going to happen. In other words, they're seeking a classic 20th century outcome using 21st century technologies. And it's that particular contradiction or tension that I think, in a sense, lies at the heart of this particular problem, where on the one hand, they've successfully, I think, been able to claim an identity without falling back on using the state as the means to do, the Burmese state as the means to do that. Yet at the same time, their imagination, their imaginary, if you will, is one that in a sense, perhaps is increasingly impossible to imagine. And yet they can't think beyond that in terms of trying to imagine what a 21st century deterritorialized nation might look like, even as they're in the process of constituting it and representing it through these databases and through these other means. So let me stop at that point in terms of telling you the Rohingya story and switch to talking about the politics, or rather technology and politics, and trying to sort of fit these pieces together. Now, I think all the STS people listening to me, I think know only too well that there's a long tradition of thinking about technology and politics. Particularly, I would argue, Lewis Mumford, of course, is the big name there, but of course, he's drawing on earlier traditions going back to Marx and Veblen. Technology is a condition of modernity leading to dystopia, but simultaneously, there's a narrative about technology as liberation, of which, to me, Elon Musk sort of represents the living example of that particular technophilia, which can only lead to good and wonderful things. And with the vaccine pandemic, with the COVID vaccine appearing in a year's time, which has never happened before, the people who believe in that point of view are clearly, have got something to argue for. That's an older tradition that in a sense traps us between the dilemma of saying, on the one hand, dystopia, on the other hand, liberator, and kind of beyond that, it's hard to really say anything other than saying we go down one path or the other. But you could argue that there are two vectors, really, in terms of how we think about this relationship. One is from politics to technology. And here we think of Langdon Winner as the classic example of somebody who argues when the artifact has, artifacts have values, technological artifacts have values built into them. That's really about the politics of design and outcomes shaping technology. And the other one is the example that I've been talking about today, which is when we move from technologies to politics, or the manipulation of the political field through the presence, intersections, and absences of technologies in different sorts of ways. Now, that's, in a sense, in a very, very crude and broad way, a summary of how we've thought about technology and politics so far. What I want to suggest, though, is that while the technological part of that story has been extremely well developed and thought through in so many different ways, including by many people probably listening to this talk, the political side of it, I think, has been left somewhat underdeveloped. And it's that part of it that I want to get at today, because for the most part, we've talked very much in the STS literature, mostly about liberal democracies and about the limits or the constraints on democracy that have been imposed by technological developments, whether system-wide or whether in a micro fashion, as with all the discussions about artificial intelligence and so on today. We haven't really opened up that political field, I think, to the kind of scrutiny that it needs, and that I'm suggesting this Rohingya talk, in a sense, points us towards thinking about. So by defining the political, I want to suggest that we want to go beyond the binary of reinforcing inequalities or offering forms of liberation. I want to suggest that we need to go beyond liberal democracies, complicating the state-citizen relationship or the public-private one, classic themes and tropes within the STS literature. I want to suggest we must go beyond direct confrontation and traditional political instruments, imagine new paths and meanings given to the political, and of course, not restricted to physical territories anymore. We have to think about the virtual and the diasporic, and we have to think beyond traditional political sites such as Parliament and Congress. I don't think anyone would particularly agree would disagree with this list. But if you think about it, we haven't really moved very far in terms of thinking through what the new political fields in front of us may look like and how to think through the technopolitics of those spaces. So I'm going to just leave it at this point and now jump one step further. And this is, to sort of take this to the extreme, to the limit, and say, what then, if we were to imagine a global STS, what would it look like? So I want to put it in more concrete terms. I want to suggest that what would STS look like if its starting point were the technosciences emergent from the informal sector of global cities such as Kuala Lumpur, Mumbai, Nairobi, or Mexico City. And the choice of each of these terms is quite specific. I do want to think informal sector. I do want to think global city. And I do want to think, obviously, of the global south. Now, that, in a sense, is the majority of the world, where all sorts of interesting innovations and experiments are taking place, as I think many of you know. And what would an STS look like if it had begun from a setting such as that? Well, here are some initial ideas about what that might be. We would have to consider as a starting point, these are the foundational conditions we would have to start with: resource and material scarcity. We'd have to imagine the actors involved as in a condition of state illegibility, involving illicit access to physical infrastructures in many cases. Precarity would be the ontology of those who are taking part in this process. Tacit knowledge and informal learning would be the means by which technological information would be shared. Social infrastructures, and here I'm thinking of people like Abdul Malik Simone and others who write about this work, as a resource, but also as norm setting in terms of technologies. Impermanence would be a typical condition rather than the permanence that we typically assume when we think about technologies. Improvisation in design and materials, actually there's a lot of literature on that, as I'm sure you're aware. Creative misuse, everyday patent violations. So we're obviously talking about a space which is not quite in the legal sphere. It's in that gray zone between the absolutely illegal and the legal. Dismantling as a kind of design priority because of the impermanence of people's dwellings and living. Just in need approach to repair and maintenance. So repair and maintenance, of course, is something that I think we have to elevate to the level of innovation. And as you know, there's a lot of work being done on maintenance, so that fits right into the kind of way I'm thinking. So these, I'm arguing, would be not an incomplete list of the kind of initial conditions that we would be imagining. But this is not about throwing STS out the window. It's actually about recasting then STS terms and concepts in order to cope with these sorts of conditions. Some of them I think would be quite obvious, and I'll just run down this list, and after that I'm going to stop. Hybridity and bricolage would be the norm. Again, not an unusual or surprising idea, I think, for us already. Assemblages of human and material objects would include waste, a term that in a sense is usually imagined as the useless part or the valueless part of any particular technopolitical or techno-scientific process. It would be incorporated in because that's a primary resource for people in the informal sector. When we think about risk, how would that idea of risk change when precarity is the everyday condition we begin with? I suggest that notions of risk would be complicated enormously and, in a sense, be reduced, not expanded. Actor network theory might become actor infrastructure networks, infrastructure being the insertion of an entirely new field within that relationship. Maintenance and repair join innovation on equal terms. Innovation includes cannibalization, misuse, and recycling. Other geographies of movement, South-South movements, would become visible in a way that they are not currently as much as they should be. NSN being North-South-North. Contact zones would become starting points for relations of interaction to begin with. So in a sense, we might begin from that hybrid space of the contact zone and end up in a clean and pure place rather than the reverse as we imagine it right now. One of the key tasks of an STS project would be the systematization of frugal engineering and tacit knowledge. Technological publics, a term that a lot of us use in different ways, would not be pre-constituted objects or pre-constituted social formations, but rather be the outcome of applications of different kinds of technoscience to a national body or to a political body. And finally, for those of you who are interested in the question of aesthetics, something we don't talk as much as we should, I think, when it comes to questions of design in STS. I'm using these metaphorically, of course. I would argue that the aesthetics would move from smooth to rough, and collage and palimpsest would be the kind of the condition of the aesthetic, in keeping with the idea of hybridity, in keeping with the idea of repair, in keeping with the idea of waste being part of the larger resource base that we would be applying. Okay, I'm going to stop at that point. thank you all for listening, and I'm looking forward to any comments or questions or anything else that you might want to share with me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Itty. We had just such a really interesting, thought-provoking talk. So just a little bit of just management for the Q&A. So I'll be sort of managing sort of folks on the list for the Q&A. If you can either physically raise your hand or use your little icon in Zoom, that would just really help a lot to sort of keep track of questions, and I'll start creating a list. We will kind of go ahead and get started with the Q&A. So I thought I'd start maybe with Bob Cook-Deegan. He posted a question in the chat. Just want to get to that before we might lose some things in the chat. He had a question going back to the Rohingya, the first part of your talk. And so he was asking, using the example of the baby born in Malaysia, how does that child gain entry to the database? If you could just sort of talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Sure. There's a couple of different ways in which that would happen. If their parents are Rohingya already and are registered in the database, the child automatically gets registered in the database. I mean, there's a process involved, but since the parents are Rohingya, it shouldn't be a problem. If only one parent is Rohingya, it depends whether it's the man or the woman. So if the mother is Rohingya, sometimes there's an issue about whether the child is Rohingya or not, because it's, frankly speaking, a very patriarchal society. However, if she's registered through her Rohingya husband in the database, again, it's not that difficult for the child to become registered. What is a problem is when both parents are Rohingya but are not registered in the database. And when they find out about the database and they want to get registered, they have to prove that the child is theirs. And the way they do that is through social infrastructure. Essentially, the community people that they're living with, usually the headman of the community that they're with, will endorse or will provide an affidavit of some kind. Again, not a legal affidavit, but probably a verbal and oral one, to say that, yes, this is the child of these parents, and these are legitimate members of our community. You can admit them into the database. So there's a combination, you might say, of different approaches or methods, depending on the status of the parents in the case of the child.
Great, thank you. So I see Kirk has his hand up next, and I'll continue to take questions. So Kirk, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, Eddie. Thank you very much for this really wonderful talk. I really appreciated it, enjoyed it. My question for you, and your last slide there about recasting STS and something, imagining if it had not emerged from the global north, that was really inspiring and made me thought of a lot of work out there in the STS community that's being done presently. And I'm curious to know, I'm just thinking particularly from the cultural anthropology world that has been informing STS and most recently post-colonial studies within STS. Can you talk a little bit about where you see some of the most exciting centers of work that are happening within the STS community that inspire you and align with the agenda that you're proposing here today?
Within the STS community or different parts of the world, you mean?
Within the STS community, of course, STS being a global community, but I guess what I'm saying is, like you said, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's exciting research that's happening within the STS community that I think has the same sentiments that you're describing. So could you tell me where you think some of that exciting work is right now?
Well, you know, I have identified myself as being part of a post-colonial technoscience world, right? And let me try and mark the difference between where I began and where I am now. I think an earlier generation, or the first iteration of that particular moment of scholarship, was really about inclusion, about saying that, you know, we simply don't have enough examples or studies of work being done in non-Western settings. And so you've got bush pumps in Zimbabwe, or you've got, in my case, you know, nuclear power coming out of India. You've got Zulfikar's work on aeroplanes in Indonesia. So you've got, you know, in a sense, an attempt to try and say, okay, all these different countries are doing different interesting things as well. Here are scholars working on those, but in those particular national traditions. We must include this in the larger database of the STS world, you might say, in order to be more representative of where we were before. What that didn't, although that was good from an empirical standpoint, what that didn't do, I think, was engage adequately or sufficiently with the core concepts that, in a sense, shape the field. And I think this comes in a variety of different kinds of ways. I mean, maybe one way of flagging it would be thinking about repair maintenance, which, as you know, there's a lot of new work coming out, not always in STS, but even in other fields as well. or infrastructure studies, another area that's very, very active today, or from a more political standpoint, the notion of what a public is. Now, once we start thinking about publics as constituted not as necessarily as legal citizens, but rather as social formations that are interpolated or called into being through their interaction with a particular assemblage or with a particular technology, we change the meaning, I think, of the public, its relationship, citizenship, and relation to the state, right? So this might be a confrontational public, it might be a passive public, it doesn't really matter. But what I'm trying to say is that once we think about the different formations that operate in a normal setting like a city like Jakarta, we're forced in a sense to question the everydayness of the way that we use public in other settings. So I see this, the outline that I gave at the end is a chance for us, I think, to go back to some of the core concepts in STS and to interrogate them from a standpoint where the meanings of those terms aren't as stable and aren't as consensually agreed upon as they might be in, say, the United States or in Western Europe. And so that to me is really productive, because I think that opens up, not only incorporates concepts and ideas coming out of the global South, but puts them in relation to or in dialogue with existing concepts in the STS field. And the outcome, I think, can only be good for all of us. And so that's kind of how I'm imagining this. And these are some of the examples of the areas of work that I think we could build on. And I mean, to be honest, we've only just started doing this, right? There's really many, many more things that that we should and could be doing. And I was hoping to give you a kind of a sketch of some of the ways we'd be thinking in order to do this well. So there's more work that needs to be done. There's probably work that's already out there that doesn't get reflected in the list that I've made. I know, for example, business schools have fallen in love with this idea of improvisation, jugaad, as it's often, is the Indian word that reflects that. Of course, I'm not thrilled by the way they use it, but I think that if we can incorporate that and bring it into dialogue with other sorts, with notions of hybridity and bricolage that have been around with us for much longer, I think that's the kind of dialogue that I'm trying to encourage.
Thanks, Itty. That was really helpful. As you were talking, like Nikhil Anand's work immediately resonated with me as somebody who's been informing STS from a different angle as the way you described it. So thank you.
That's right. You're thinking about the infrastructure guy, right? Water and infrastructure.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So next I have Netra, who I think is coming through Michelle Walker's Zoom screen, and then we'll have Craig next.
Itty, thank you very much for raising sort of a very critical and very important point around the politics of technology. For me, technology is always political because there is a state involvement and there is a proprietary involvement, and then now largely involvement of the elites and the rich folks in innovation of technology and taking that technology to the public at large. So thank you also for urging us to recasting the future of technology, particularly with regards to the governance of it. But I would like you to expand a little bit on what does it mean to be governing technology by mobilizing public at large, so that they have a say in that technology, not as a user, but who can also make a policy around technology or control that technology or govern however they want to govern. I would really appreciate, if you just say something about that.
Well, I'm aware that we've got David Gusson listening to us. And, if there's anyone who knows something about how the publics are governing technology, it's him. So I'll be very careful what I say here. Let me just suggest that we're sort of at the back of I felt at the back of your question was the idea of a large technological system and the relationship of the public to that system. And I think on that front, I really don't have much to offer in the sense of suggesting new modes of governance or new ways of thinking. I think the literature already provides us with many, very, solid and, not always successful, but, many, many thoughtful ways of doing that, from participation to anticipation onwards, right? So when we think of large technological systems, the dams, the power stations, and the airports, all of that I think falls into one category of politics of technology. I think there's another kind of technological system that we can imagine coming back to my chart or coming back to my outline at the end, which is the ways in which needs-based responses are created in informal sectors in global cities. Now, in a sense, I think, for example, of the ways in which electricity is channeled in places like Islamabad. Now, Islamabad is a city of probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 million people, and only less than 1 million people actually pay for electricity. But many, many more people have access to it. So there's a way in which the communities which are illegal communities, bastis, have negotiated with the state and with the electrical supplier to provide them with electricity at a fee that is not part of the normal mandated metered cost, in using their own meters, using their own wiring, using their own systems to extract electricity for the areas that they live in. But at the same time, it's one that is governed by the local community in negotiation with the official body. So I don't know what to call it, because it's an entirely illegal system, which is sanctioned by the state or tacitly, given approval by the electricity board. It collects money, but at a different fee rate and system than anything else. Now that's taken probably 15 years to develop to the way that it is now. You could almost call it semi-official, but of course it isn't. And so, you've got this strange gray area, it seems to me, where if we start looking more and more carefully at the ways in which communities organize themselves in relation to technological goods and probably bads as well, we will come up, I think, with ways of arguing and seeing things, provided we don't start from a presumption that it must be legal, it must be legitimate, it must be legible, and it must be driven by the state. So I'm trying to highlight, I think, a zone of fuzziness, of grayness, of informality and illicitness, in which there are negotiations which we would call governance, I think, by any measure, but which don't follow the normal patterns and norms of the way that we've seen them so far.
Thank you, Itty.
That's the example that comes to mind right away, because it's one that there's been quite a lot of writing about. And USAID, for example, is tearing its hair out because it wants to, on the one hand, provide electricity to everybody, and yet the mode by which it's done is one that they can't endorse because it's not legal and above board. So.
Thank you. So Craig is next, and then Alex.
Thanks, Itty, for great talk. Your last slide was particularly wonderful with the list of ways in which a global STS might rethink a number of different domains. And I just want to ask you to draw out a little more what I take to be your argument that this is not just how to take account of the global south, but how thinking from the global south might change thinking generally. And thus ways in which all of these things are going on in the global north too, in varying degree. And states have varying capacity to try to dominate the illicit and make it licit. But there are biohacker communities, and there are various kinds of people writing AI code as hackers. There are, we could go down a list of all sorts of ways in which the fuzziness, as you called it, is present in relatively empowered states. It may be that those states are becoming less powerful in some sense, that there is a weakening of some of the ability of the global north to make the suture in nation state hold. But it might also be that this has been a both and process all along, and we just haven't been looking at one side of it. So I'm curious how you think about the global north in this sense.
Yeah. Well, the way you ended is a little more tricky. I'm not sure about that, which is whether we've been seeing it all along. I think that takes a little more thinking and digging, I think, to find out whether that's true or not. Whether the question of state capacity has declined over time or has gotten more enhanced, I think it's, of course, it's a domain-centric answer in some ways, right? So we know, for example, on the military front, there hasn't been any particular change of the way that the state has been able to perform itself. It's, if anything, gotten worse and more dangerous. But by the same token, we've also got a result of, I'm thinking still of the military domain, responding to IEDs and the kind of guerrilla warfares that became prominent and became normalized after Afghanistan, after that long war in Afghanistan, forced, in a sense, states to respond in ways that they weren't expecting to do. Essentially, they had the wrong kind of equipment, the wrong kind of profile for the kind of wars that they've been fighting for the last 20 years. And that continues to this day. And if you argue, I could even argue, to take it one step further, that one of the reasons why China has become such an acceptable enemy for the United States right now is because it promises a return to a kind of warfare that the United States is very good at. And that's not a reason for them to go to war with China, but it is a reason for the Pentagon to get on board with this in a way that would be quite different if it was another war in Syria, another war in Afghanistan, another war in the Middle East, or somewhere like that. But coming back to the original point about, what do we learn or what can we gain from this looking at the global South idea? In a sense, what I'm saying is that is the global North, although that's a little too broad for me, let's just say the United States for now, is it a special case? And I think that the answer is yes. And I'm not sure we've always seen it as that in the STS literature or in other disciplinary fields as well. And I think that that's not a bad thing to consider. When I was, for example, studying in graduate school and, sort of studying about American politics, the question of democracy was never asked, was never questioned. It's always assumed that the presidency would be there and the legislature would be there and the Congress would be there and, all the three branches would operate as they should. And the question was simply about fine tuning or getting it right or, seeing what rules operated in all these different institutions. That there might be a zone outside of politics framed in those terms wasn't something that even came up at all. Although when we talked about urban politics in particular, I think we saw it in different ways, but that fell into kind of into ethnic politics, African-American politics, urban politics. That was kind of a little gray area. It wasn't really American politics as it could be or should be or would be. So if it forces, I think, a reconsideration of the terms on which the special case, the United States, is constituted, that can only be good because that's a moment of reflexivity. And here we've got a nice wide array of things to look for in order to measure that specialness against. So this, of course, has to be separated from exceptionalism, right? I mean, there's a fine line there between special case and exceptionalism. But, I think that's the starting place for, that's the productive reason, I think, to engage in this exercise. Simply, it helps us to get to know ourselves better. Then these questions of capacity and so on, I think, become situated, I think, a little more concretely and become easier to think. But at the end of the day, I'm a bit nervous about generalizing across all politics and across all technologies. And I'd rather kind of go domain specific to say, well, in this case, it's like that. And, maybe the whole IT computing, hacking space is not one that falls easily into this kind of category either, because both the rate of change, the global spread of it, and the recent and how relatively novel it is, makes it a little bit difficult for us to make those sorts of claims in quite the same way. But yeah, I'll stop at that point.
Thank you. So Alex and then Kiki.
Hi there. So I'm going to take us in a different direction here. So early in your talk, you talked about the Rohingya as a borderlands community. And this particularly piqued my interest. I'm interested in borderlands work. And it reminded me of the phrasing of my go-to borderlands thinker, Gloria Anzaldúa, whose archives were at UT Austin, where you used to be. And she wrote that borderlands means that you're neither from here and neither from there.
Yeah.
And it was a reminder of the US-Mexico border as a colonial border, even though we don't think of it that way so much. And the ways that the indigenous people of that particular borderlands get caught without recognition from either side. And so giving you a chance for improvisation here, how do you envision that you can apply some of this research that you were just talking about locally to, okay, it's two parts. One, how do you envision applying this research locally to Arizona and our borders? And then my second part is expanding bigger. What other intersections of global borderlands and STS could you also relate to what you were thinking about today?
Yeah. So yes, so the borderlands part of the, they're not called a borderlands community except by me, because so much of the identity of the Rohingya today is contested in this particular way of being in either A or B, and their own history isn't as well written as it should be for a whole variety of different reasons. And there has been migration as well. So let me back up a second. So the Burmese say that the Rohingya all traveled from Bangladesh, what is now Bangladesh, to settle in the area of Arakan. The Rohingya themselves contest that and say, no, there was a community of people who spread across what is now 2 countries. And both the Rakhine people and the Rohingya people were intermingled with each other. And when the Rakhine people were being attacked by the Burmese people, they would flee up to the north and live in Bangladesh, what is now Bangladesh, and so on. So it seems to me that the appropriate way to describe this community is borderlands, a borderlander community, but one in which they're unable, in a sense, to find a home on either side, right? So there are other ways in which borderland communities are sometimes constituted as being included on both sides and yet having an identity in the middle. This isn't one of those. This is very much one in which they're straddling the border and unable to find a home, quote unquote, on either side. The question of borderlands now, it seems to me, has been complicated in a different way by the diaspora. So we're talking, in Gloria Anzaldua's terms, when we're thinking about the US-Mexico border, we're still thinking very much in terms of physical space, right? And we're thinking of a community or communities that are divided by the national boundaries of both those countries. How do we insert a diasporic element and component into that story and still be able to, or capture this idea of borderlanders in a more complicated way? I think that's, for me, the kind of the first step that I'm not able to really answer at this point, but that's how I want to think about it. Because it seems to me that the diaspora, of course, is a different kind of boundary that we're imagining, right? Where the boundary, if you will, between a particular territorial space and another location. The diaspora also operating in virtual space or electronic space constitutes, in a sense, a different modality of border boundary. And yet you've got this community spread over these 2 places. So I'm not answering your question, I understand. But what I'm trying to say is that actually we're in a place when we're talking about this community where we've got other layers of borders or other kinds of boundaries that are dividing them and joining them simultaneously, which we need to consider and need to think about. So the technology question doesn't necessarily enter intimately all of those different spaces, but it is one of the forces that's helping to bind them together in this new configuration, which is both diasporic and virtual and physical all at the same time. So that's the way I'm sort of imagining this particular relationship at this time. Who else would I think about? Well, the community that comes to mind right away, it's not exactly a borderland community, but back to the 1990s is the Chiapas. And I'm thinking of Subcomandante Marcos and the way in which he began to articulate a vision of a community that is close to a border, but in a sense dominated by the Mexican state, but using virtual space or using electronic means in order to take their struggle and the imagination of what they were doing to a much wider space and to a much wider people. Now, that too had a diaspora. I mean, that too has a separation. The people from Chiapas didn't just stay in Chiapas, they were in other parts of the United States and other places and Mexico as well. How were they brought together? How were they bound together? What did it mean that there was this struggle going on in Chiapas for autonomy and liberation on the basis of indigenous rights? Now, that's a different kind of struggle, it seems to me, than the struggle that the Rohingya are going through, because their imagination of what their future is not a Chiapas type solution at all. Rather, it's very much a national the kind of national imagination that a country like India or a country like Indonesia or a country like China would have imagined when they were going through their independence struggles in the early part or the first half of the 20th century. So there are some similarities, but there are, I think, some important differences. Where else would I think about? Maybe another, well, I don't know if they're borderland community or not, but the Tamil diaspora, the Tamil community in Sri Lanka and India, and in Canada and Australia, again, constitute this kind of divided, separated, diasporic, virtual entity, which is both physical and virtual at the same time, and which uses different forms of technology and modes of being in order to create the sense of its body, a virtual and physical body at the same time. Like that, I suppose you could argue for the Kurds and other sorts of people as well, classic borderlander communities, spanning 3 or 4 states in the case of the Kurds, and yet where, in a sense, the articulation of what it means to be a nation lies outside that physical space, in another place, in another setting, and involving other kinds of politics. So you've just raised this sort of a very complicated question, and so I'm not trying to say I have the answer to it, but I'm trying to tell you how I think about it.
And it also sounds like as you're talking, then you're getting into these like notions of like imagined communities, or like the imaginedness of or of home in diaspora for a place that no longer exists, or a place that only exists like in the imagination, or like in the emotion. Is that right?
Well, that would be very much down the Gloria Anzaldúa kind of way of thinking, and the problem is that I don't know the kind of the national literatures of these communities well enough to know how those imaginations are being articulated or how those emotions are being felt. That to me is kind of where my knowledge breaks down, and I think that without access to the poetry, without access to the songs, without access to the affective ways of imagining self, there's not much I can contribute to to your framing of the question, because it's just not what I do. I mean, I'm just not good enough to do that, But I think that's the form that it takes. The poetry, the literature, the music, and probably the films as well. Oh, maybe I'm really free-ranging here, but maybe Atom Egoyan's films of the Armenian diaspora, the Canadian Armenian filmmaker Atom Egoyan, maybe would be one example of the kind of imagination that you're talking about. Armenia, of course, is both a country, but also a diaspora. I'm thinking of a movie like Calendar, for example, from a long time ago, which is all about the landscape completely imagined by a group of Canadians who want to kind of go back there and see it for themselves. So thanks. I mean, that's a great question. It's got me all confused.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Kiki, you're next.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction, because I was reviewing some of the materials you sent, and I would love to talk to you a little bit about your teaching. You shared in the materials about a course that you inherited, and then you adapted it, working with the Migrant Workers Center and creating these, what you call real world encounters. And then you also talk about through the iterations that you're adding in more elements. So I have a 3-part question about that. One, what was the pedagogical underpinning for the choices you made, the design choices you made in that course, especially as you continue to evolve it? 2, what type of assessments and evaluations were you doing to determine what evolutions to make, what new elements to add? And 3, how would you pull on the pedagogy and the evaluations to adapt a course like that to the context of ASU?
The easy one to answer is the last one. And I'm just going to be very honest and say that I don't know enough about Tempe, about Arizona, to say that properly, so I'm not going to
contextualize the question in that regard then, because I know that you had experience you were at University of Texas, so make it more broad. Let's just say, how would you contextualize it within the US?
Sure. I'll try and do that. The first question, the pedagogical understanding. Well, so you have to understand that I'm teaching in a context in which Singapore, in which migration is the norm. There's 3 generations or maybe 4 generations of people who have been living here, considering themselves as the natives or the citizens of this place. But in a sense, it's a settler community. Everybody has come here from somewhere else. Indigenous people were eliminated from this place a long time ago. But more than that, I would argue that this island, Southeast Asia, is a space of itinerant sea, if that's a word, but meaning where mobility and movement are built into the space. The sea gypsies, for example, as they're called, are part of a community of people who only live on boats, who come to land for their supplies and so on, but essentially move around on boats all the time, including childbirth and death and all those sorts of things. So we're talking of a context in which migration isn't just a thing that some people do, the way that migration studies often is taught in other places, but it's something that everybody has done or is doing at the current time. So that forces you, I think, to kind of reimagine what migration studies is, because you're actually describing the sort of the DNA of the place itself. This was not reflected in the course that I inherited. It was taught very much as a kind of a, why do people migrate? And here are the 10 reasons why they migrate. And I turned that around to say, why do people not migrate? Meaning, once we have an answer to the question of why people don't migrate, then maybe we can ask the question of why people migrate. And what I'm trying to do, in a sense, is say that everybody in this class, or everybody should consider themselves a migrant first, and treat the question of moving, of motion, of human movement as normalized, rather than treating it as something that's exceptional and unusual. I mean, if migration studies in general is a field in which, you know, it's always the question of the special person who leaves, unless it's forced migration, is what they're looking at. And I wanted to just turn that around and say, no, everyone's a migrant. Let's consider what being a migrant means in so many different ways, and not treat the question of, you know, who travels as somehow special and separate. Essentially, I said, it's my joke to begin the class, I would say, anybody who doesn't have a relative in their immediate family who's a migrant gets an A in the class and doesn't have to come again. And not once was anyone ever able to say that. So we begin with, for example, family histories, and we talk about the way in which each of us has a migrant in that family, which could even include something as simple as the way in which your food patterns change between your mother's house and your father's house, or depending on the places that you've lived at along the way. So I try and localize it as much as possible in order to get our students out of the idea that they're somehow in a stable, secure, unmoving place, and to insist that they themselves are migrants and they have to see the world in that way. So that breaks down for me that immediate barrier to some extent. Not everyone, some are resistant to that, but that breaks down that barrier for me between Singapore as a place which is composed by migration and the special category of migrant worker, who is a short-term guest worker coming from poorer parts of Southeast Asia and South Asia in order to build the infrastructure of the global city. Now, it struck me that was the primary boundary that I wanted to cross. That was the primary division that I wanted to make sense of. And I wanted the students to think through, not from their point of view, not from their privilege, not from their distance, but as somebody who was equally engaged or involved, not equally, but engaged and involved in questions of movement as well. The other aspect that I wanted to break down was the idea that Singaporeans are a people distinct from Thais, Filipinos, Indonesians, and other people who have diasporas here in Singapore. So there are particular sites, particular shopping malls usually, where communities of different national bodies gather. And part of the work that the students do is go to those places, meet with them, talk to them, and in particular, look for objects. This is my STS training, right? Look for objects in a sense that mark their diasporicness, their nationality, their distance in different kinds of ways. Sometimes it was just a leaflet on the wall. Sometimes it would be an amulet from a Thai Buddhist temple. There were different ways in which students responded to this. But again, what I'm trying to do in a sense is suggest that for the communities of people, students living here, they themselves constitute a migrant population, a diasporic population, and they need to use this class to look back on themselves in different kinds of ways. So that would be one elaborate answer, I think, to your question. The assessment and evaluation, there's a built-in assessment process in the class. Students write evaluations, and I believe I've sent those along with my dossier in the in an earlier stage, so you can get a chance to actually look at what I've done. I also got the migrant workers themselves, when we were interacting with them, to not write things down, but to do an informal qualitative survey with me at the end. Not all of them did it, just a few of them did it, the ones who were a little more articulate, a little more confident. what other form of evaluation would I have used? I think the third was the most informal of all, which is that my dissatisfaction with the way that certain aspects of the course as I taught it had gone. So it changed radically from the year one, the first time I taught it, to the third or fourth time I taught it. By the time I was doing it for the fourth time, I was also including a forced migration element to it as well. So it just so happens that not far from here, in Indonesia, but literally physically quite close, is an old refugee camp that was used by the Vietnamese boat people in the 1970s and 80s when they were fleeing from Vietnam. And this was one of the places in which they were held before they were allowed to resettle in Australia, United States, and other places. So that's now being one of those sites in a place called Pulau Galang is kept as a monument, a memorial to the people who lived there. And one of the most remarkable and troubling and important places that we visit in that journey, we go by ferry and then we go by bus once we're there, is the cemetery. And one of the tasks that I give my students is to spend 15, 20, half an hour in the cemetery and look at the gravestones. Now, it's not just a question of looking at the gravestones to see their names and to understand who they are. Immediately they come back to me and they say, have you noticed that it's a particular date, 1990, when there's more than 300 people who died in that cemetery? And I say, yeah, why do you think that happened? And that turns out to be the date in which the UNHCR says we're shutting down the camp. And those of you who are still in the camp are going to have to go back to Vietnam. And so there's a rash of suicides that takes place at that time. And they're buried there. And that's why they all have the same date, or roughly the same date of when they died. Now, I used that at the end of that particular field trip, and so on the way there in the bus, everyone is laughing and singing and, chatting and all the rest of it. But on the way back, they're all silent. They're all thinking about what they just saw. And I don't say a word. I just let it sort of, sink into where they are. And that for me allows, I feel that it's critical to get those sorts of ideas, to kind of not just treat this as a story that their grandparents tell them about how they moved here by bus, by train, by bullock cart, and everything went well. Because for them, it's a story of success, of things getting better. I'm also very, very, I feel it's crucially important to talk about the things that didn't go well, or the things that went, that ended in disaster, in individual deaths in these particular cases, as part of that story of movement and migration. So when we talk about forced migration, it means something distinct. It seems something quite important, and it can end in this way, which is just terribly, terribly sad. I don't evaluate that part of it. I don't ask for any feedback in a direct way, because I actually think it's a little too much for young people to fully comprehend. But I know something's getting into their heads, and I think that maybe years from now, they'll appreciate or they'll understand what I'm talking about, or what I wanted them to understand from that encounter. So I added that really without any prompting or without any feedback in a formal sense, but only because I felt that was something, because physically it's easy and able to do. I wanted to incorporate that into the class as well, as a different kind of outside the classroom experience. The question of how I would teach a class of migration in the United States or in Arizona, or especially, is in a sense, I think, prefigured by my discussion with Alex about borderlands. I would, of course, begin from where I started off a moment ago, which is to say that everyone's a migrant. Some, of course, not brought to the United States by choice, so forced migration then, and I'm talking obviously about slavery. Would be something that would be incorporated into a class like that. The indigenous people of Arizona is something obviously that I've got a huge interest in. It's not something I know anything about. I've been wondering how it might be possible to bring a dialogue or have some sort of connection or conversation with indigenous communities in the Arizona space. This is where my lack of knowledge sort of just keeps me quiet, and I don't want to say something stupid. So I would say that I wish I could, or I hope I'll be able to incorporate voices from communities like indigenous communities in Arizona into a class on migration, as well as the borderlands question, as well as the question of slavery, to be honest.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to jump in, and then I see Kirk's hand, and I know we're getting low on time, but I did just want to ask the question, Itty, of this is a racial justice position. And so I was wondering if you could sort of speak more specifically about how you think about racial justice. You've been working mostly kind of international, kind of global kind of context and thinking, like, how does that shape how you think about racial justice? And if you can just talk about that either related to your research or maybe connecting to what you're talking about with Kiki, like how do you grapple with and what do you bring, I guess, to that conversation?
Yeah, well, it's a hard question to answer, and I'm going to try and just get at it in a couple of different ways. One is, I think, the question of injustice is something that you start with, and I think that both understanding, looking for, appreciating, acknowledging injustice is the first step, I think, towards thinking about justice, thinking about any kind of reparative condition or any kind of response to the questions of injustice. Now, I think if you look at a lot of the work that I've done on, especially on communities affected by nuclear power, I think you will see right away that questions of injustice, biological or biomedical injustice, as well as political injustice, is something that I've taken very seriously. And you can read my work to see what I've said and what I think about it. But I think the other part of it would come from the question of racial. I think is something that is a more complicated story because it's one of those, as you know, one of those words that, in a sense, means more than one thing at the same time, right? I mean, it's a kind of it's a super sign, as one of my colleagues calls it. It's both a condition that we acknowledge as being meaningless from the point of view of from a biological standpoint, yet at the same time enormously consequential from the point of view of the politics or the everyday interactions of people. What it means in the United States and what it means in Southeast Asia are two different words. You use the word race here all the time. Singapore is considered to be a place where the Chinese race, the Malay race, the Indian race, and other races all meet. So they don't say ethnicity, they don't think about it in those terms. They want to use the word race because it's a direct hangover from the colonial period, right? But race doesn't mean that in the United States. Race means something else in the United States, right? And so, in a sense, once negotiating, I think, all these different categories, how do you, I think about it in a couple of different ways. Injustice, I think, would be my starting point, and then seeing, in a sense, where and how racial divisions and distinctions fit in. Now, if you take a historical approach like I do, and if you work on parts of the world that are part of the, if you will, post-colonial world, the question of race is always present. It's never not there. It's always present in different kinds of ways. And it basically acts as a marker to separate and to continue the perpetuation of domination of one community or communities over others. I would think, for example, about one of the ways I like to think about it is making the links between different communities that have been oppressed in different ways. For example, the Dalit community in India and indigenous communities or African American communities in the United States. That's a conversation that's just beginning to happen, maybe a few years late. And some of the terms, some of the ideas, some of the words, some of the concepts have started traveling between those different places. So, for example, there's the Dalit community created a category called the Dalit Panthers, borrowing directly from the Black Panther movement because they saw that as inspiring. And had already, of course, were aware of Martin Luther King and his travels to the United States, but had not seen the more radical side of the movement for liberation of African Americans, and then discovered the Dalit Panther, and then discovered the Black Panthers. Now, they didn't take everything that the Panthers did. For example, they didn't look at the way in which the medical, the medical outreach of the Black Panthers in the African American communities, that wasn't something that they carried over to India. Rather, they took a kind of a liberation idea, and especially through literature and through writing and through song, as the particular mode of how they would express themselves in order to become more free. Yet they want to use this term to acknowledge the links between them, which, in a sense, you can't. This is not a global social movement. These are independent formations in different places, but they are seeing connections between each other, which I think are really significant and that we have to take super seriously, right? So I don't have a pat answer to what you're asking, to be honest. I want to point to my own work as one place in which I try and work through some of these questions, especially around injustice. And I want to point to connections that I can make, that I can see between different places where communities marked by race or demarcated by some either biological or political category find themselves in conditions which are similar to others in other places. And I think the more we can make those connections and understandings of them, the better off we are.
Thank you. I know we're getting very close on time, but I do want to let Kirk, if he wants to jump in very quickly to ask the last question.
Sure. Yeah, Itty, that was a really great response to Catherine's question. I appreciated that. My last question, I guess, is so many in SFIS really strongly value scholarship that integrates public engagement components or researching with.
Sorry, I missed that.
No, I'm sorry, that many in SFIS really value engaged scholarship or researching with as opposed to researching on. And can you just articulate just a little bit about how you imagine, as being a senior hire here and as being somebody who may end up in the leadership position, how you can be an ally to those sentiments, because it's a very strong part of the culture here at SFIS.
The question of engagement now.
But how you can be an ally to scholarship that's happening amongst the faculty here in SFIS that really want to do that sort of work.
That's a hard question to answer in the abstract, because my immediate answer is that I'll help in any way I can. But I know that's not the answer that you're looking for. I think, okay, I've had the great advantage of both working with and in different parts of the world. And I think that that's actually given me enormous insights, both into different kinds of scholarship that's being done, scholarship that doesn't always meet the standard of publication in the American Political Science Review, but nonetheless is engaged organic scholarship, if you will, or knowledge building, coming out of social movements, coming out of disenfranchised communities. There is knowledge taking place in all these places. One simple thing that I can do is to say, are you aware of, or link up people at SFIS with ways of thinking and ways of, well, with ideas and with knowledge coming out of different parts of the world. I'm also aware of or familiar with a number of communities of scholars working, for example, in agriculture or biomedical stuff, again, cited and located in different parts of the world. Those sorts of dialogues are things that I want to bring to ASU if I end up moving there and if I get offered this job. Meaning I don't want this to be, I'm trying to think or trying to imagine also a place where I don't leave everything that I've done before behind, but I want, in a sense, to infiltrate, to contaminate, to kind of, to build, to grow the stuff that I'm familiar with, the people that I know, the stuff that, I get moved by. I want to bring that into the conversation that you guys are already having. I think I can add some new things to it. And I think that when young scholars, when junior scholars see other work that's being done and see other modes by which work is being done, it might offer them models of scholarship and models of knowledge building that they're not yet familiar with or that they're not aware of. There's a tension there because this is also a career. This is also has very clear pathways to professionalism, right? But I think that STS is the kind of field that allows for a little more fuzziness on the edges and the borders. So I wouldn't say this for someone in a disciplinary field where the rules, I think, are much stricter and where the norms are, a little more punitive. But I think STS actually does allow you to be a little more flexible. When this word knowledge, for example, it's a big word. But more than that, I think I think we're comfortable enough to say that there are different modes of knowledge that aren't always commensurable with each other, but that we can recognize as knowledge in its own terms or on its own merits, right? Now, can one learn from that kind of engaged knowledge practice that's taking place in some movement somewhere and incorporate it into your work right now? Yes, I think you can. And I think it forces us to think of new ways of doing this work, new modes by which scholarship is produced. And if I can help bring those conversations into the to bear in this setting, I feel I'll be doing something of value. So I want to bring my networks to Arizona. I want to share what I know about different parts of the world, how people do things. And I want to say, I am and want to encourage new ways of doing and writing and thinking and building, which don't necessarily conform to the 8,000 word journal article format.
Thanks, Eddie. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Great way to end. So we're over time just a little bit, so we're going to have to go ahead and end the talk. But let's thank Itty for his presentation. And there definitely are opportunities to have either small group or individual sessions with him later today, as well as on Thursday. So feel free to sign up for those. And thank you, everyone, for coming today.